In the next 10 minutes, I will discuss the Global Compact on Migration and with regard to access to basic services. And more specifically, I'll firstly say a few words about the role of human rights in the Global Compact generally, and then focus more specifically on Objective 15, which is the one that deals with access to basic services. And then to place the Compact in a bit of a broader context, I will also look at the New York Declaration before very, very briefly looking ahead. And I will actually be echoing quite a few things that have been said earlier today. So the Global Compact for Migration explicitly says that it rests on a number of core international human rights treaties, including the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which is very relevant for access to basic services, such as healthcare, for instance. The states have also emphasized in the Compact that the human rights of migrants must be respected, protected, and fulfilled at all times. And they acknowledge an overarching obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill the human rights of all migrants, regardless of their migration status. So here we see that the Compact really echoes this human rights language and seems to really protect the human rights of all migrants, regular as well as irregular. However, what we also see is a certain tension that runs throughout the Global Compact between, on the one hand, national sovereignty and states' desire to control their borders and who enters their territory, and on the other hand, human rights. And this is really exemplified in paragraph 15, which contains the guiding principles. As one of the guiding principles is national sovereignty, and recalls that states may distinguish between regular and irregular migration status in accordance with international law. And so here we see that this difference between regular and irregular migration status starts to make a difference, although because it has to be in accordance with international law, as we will see later, the principle of non-discrimination does kind of put some limits to the extent to which states can actually make this distinction, but they really emphasize that they could make it. And then, as I mentioned, another guiding principle is human rights, and here the Compact states that states ensure effective respect for and protection and fulfillment of the human rights of all migrants, regardless of their migration status, across all stages of the migration cycle. So if we're thinking of protection-seeking migrants, who, before they're being recognized as refugees, if at all, they will generally tend to be in an irregular rather than regular situation. They do have human rights, but maybe states have less obligations towards them than towards regular migrants. So there is this tension here. And we see that this tension is also there as regards access to basic services. So Objective 15, which is to provide access to basic services for migrants, states that the states commit to ensure that all migrants, regardless of their migration status, can exercise their human rights through safe access to basic services. And I think this sentence is very important because if we apply it to protection-seeking migrants, it means that they must have safe access to basic services. However, we also see in the rest of the paragraph that states again say that nationals and regular migrants may be entitled to more comprehensive service provision, so some are more equal than others. So this kind of reflects again this tension between universal human rights and state sovereignty that we saw earlier. And the last part, which refers to any differential treatment, which must be based on law, be proportionate, and pursue a legitimate aim in accordance with international human rights law, that really echoes the language of non-discrimination as it has been developed in human rights law. And so really, if we look at protection-seeking migrants and their access to basic services, the basic point is that they are entitled to access basic services. However, having said that, if you look at the rest of Objective 15, after this kind of initial paragraph, like other objectives, there is a phrase that follows, which says that to realize this commitment, we will draw from the following actions, and then there is a list of actions. So in terms of practice, as to what states actually have to do to realize this is rather vague, because there is a list of actions of which states can choose to implement some, right? And as we will see, this kind of is also reflected in the New York Declaration, which, as you know, precedes both global compacts. And here again, the starting point is quite positive since the New York Declaration reaffirms the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and states in it also recall the core international human rights treaties, and they reaffirm and will fully protect the human rights of all refugees and migrants, regardless of status, as all are rights holders. So this is quite strong language and quite positive because it says that refugees, regular migrants, irregular migrants, they all have human rights. However, as you probably also know, the New York Declaration is divided in a number of parts where states distinguish their commitments towards, on the one hand, the ones that apply to both refugees and migrants, and then on the other hand, the ones that apply only to migrants and the ones that apply only to refugees. And here we will see that states also seem to consider that they have different obligations and less far-reaching obligations towards migrants as they do towards refugees. So as regards the commitments that apply to both refugees and migrants, again, we see language like full respect and protection for their human rights and fundamental freedoms, but also recognizing that states have rights and responsibilities to manage and control their borders. So again, this tension between human rights and state sovereignty, but border control procedures must be implemented in conformity with applicable obligations under international law. And to take a very specific example of access to basic services, so if we look at children and education, states stated that they are determined to ensure that all children are receiving education within a few months of arrival. And if we now look at the commitments that apply only to migrants according to the New York Declaration, again, we see that on the one hand, states are committed to protecting the safety, dignity, and human rights and fundamental freedoms of all migrants, regardless of their migratory status at all times. But also, each state has a sovereign right to determine whom to admit to its territory, subject to that state's international obligations. So here again, we see this tension between state sovereignty and universal human rights. And a little bit like what we see later in the Global Compact on migration, there are very few concrete commitments regarding access to basic services. So for instance, the language that we see is that states reaffirm their commitment to protect the human rights of migrant children and to provide access to basic health, education, and psychosocial services, which is really very vaguely worded. And likewise, the Global Compact for Migration doesn't contain very strong and very detailed commitments. And this is quite striking, especially if we compare it to the commitments that states have made for refugees, which are much more concrete. For instance, they are determined to provide quality primary and secondary education in safe learning environments for all refugee children within a few months of the initial displacement. So here you see that the language is much stronger, much more detailed, which suggests that states consider that they have more far-reaching obligations towards refugees than they do towards migrants. And this is, again, reflected later in the Global Compact, which does recognize that all migrants have access to basic services, but in practice, it really remains to be seen to what extent states will implement it. And this is also really my last point, and that ties into what Catherine was saying this morning about effectiveness. So if we see the Global Compact as a list of 23 objectives, and for each objective, a list of actions that states can take, the question to what extent the Global Compact really succeeds in safeguarding the rights of migrants as regards access to basic services really depends on how states will implement it. So which objectives will they follow? What will they focus on? What actions will they take? Which actions will they not take? And so I think here really the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and we'll have to see what states do with this Global Compact to really be able to assess its meaning.